John Gotti was one of the most famous crime bosses of the Cosa Nostra. Despite his long list of criminal offenses, he was known for his flamboyant lifestyle and ability to avoid trial. Those who were on Gotti's good side admired this powerful leader, but those who crossed over to his bad side had enough reason to sleep with one eye open. Despite his long list of criminal activities, many people in Queens thought of John Gotti and his family as good neighbors. They lived in the Howard Beach area of Queens, New York. Directly behind their house lived the Favara family. Everything seemed to be picture-perfect for the two families until one fateful afternoon. John Gotti's 12-year-old son Frank was ecstatic that he made the football team. He went outside to play with his friends and celebrate his big day. His celebration quickly turned into a tragedy when the child was struck by John Favara's car as the neighbor was driving home, allegedly intoxicated. Despite all of the witnesses present at the time, no charges were ever laid against Favara for the incident. The incident itself rattled John Gotti and his family, but the actions of the Favara family afterward took things to a new level. Some people might say that John Favara wrote his own fate when he supposedly got behind the wheel drunk that day. In today's video, we're going to cover the story of his disappearance and how John Gotti got away with it. Stay tuned to find out what really happened. In 1980, John Gotti lived in Herald Beach with his wife Victoria and their 5 children, daughters Angela and Victoria, and sons John A., Frank, and Peter. John and Victoria first met in a bar in 1958. They got married 4 years later in 1962. There were also rumors that Gotti had 2 mistresses from Staten Island whom he impregnated. One of these women was Gambino associate Aaron Test Grillo's wife, Shannon. Despite the rumors swirling around about his affairs, John and Victoria's marriage survived. They ultimately stayed together until he passed away in 2002. Behind the Gottis lived the Favaras. John Favara was a 51-year-old furniture factory worker. Although he wasn't a wealthy man, Favara was well recognized in the community. He had a wife and 2 sons. His boys were known to hang out with the Gotti children and other kids in the neighborhood. March 18, 1980 started out as an exciting day. Frank Gotti found out that he made the football team. He was excited about the news and wanted to tell everyone he knew. That's when he decided to go outside and play on his neighbor's dirt bike. His older sister Victoria saw him playing on the bike when she was walking home. She reminded him that he needed to be home by 5 for dinner. Frank agreed but continued to play. The kid was familiar with the neighborhood and the people in it. That's probably why he felt safe enough to take the bike out onto the road. But what he never expected was for his neighbor to come barreling down the road driving drunk. John Favara didn't see Frank when he struck him with his car. People were outside screaming at him to stop, but Favara kept driving. It got to the point where people were banging on his windows and jumping on the hood of his car, but he kept going. He drove 200 feet before anyone could get him to stop, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Frank Gotti was rushed to the hospital where he was declared dead. After an investigation was performed into the incident, no charges were laid. According to reports, Frank Gotti was playing in a blind area, making it difficult for the driver to see him. While it was a tragic incident, it was ultimately ruled an accident. Despite the witnesses and Gotti's claims that John Favara was intoxicated while driving, nothing was done about it. Favara tried to claim that he wasn't drunk and that the son was blindsiding him. This left the Gotti family in a state of despair. According to the Gottis, they never received an apology from John Favara. Witnesses claimed that the man even ranted and raved about how reckless the Gotti boy was, basically putting all of the blame on the child. Not only did he show little remorse, but neighbors also said that he didn't clean the blood from his car after the event. At the time of the accident, Mrs. Gotti and their daughter Victoria went to the hospital. John Gotti immediately met them there. Victoria could remember her father saying that he was afraid for the first time in his life. The entire family had trouble coping with the news of Frank's death, but Mrs. Gotti took it the worst. She spent many days breaking down in her room crying. Things began to go too far, and she injured herself with a piece of a broken mirror. On another occasion, she took too many sleeping pills. Worried about his wife's state, John Gotti sought professional help for her. No amount of professional help is enough to calm a grieving mother. The day after Frank's funeral, her stress was at an all-time high. Her baby boy was gone, and the man responsible for his suffering was living directly behind her as if nothing had happened. It made her sick and drove her insane. She heard what sounded like music and laughter coming from the Favara property. This broke her. She picked up a baseball bat and headed next door. But before any damage could be done, John Gotti appeared on the scene and quietly escorted his wife back to their home. There are a few different tales of what happened that day with the bat. Some say that Mrs. Gotti went over to that property on her own accord. But some reports have another story of how the first incident with the baseball bat went down. Some say that John Favara went to Gotti's house to apologize and was met by Mrs. Gotti's bat. Either way, she wasn't finished. Once John Gotti went to bed that night, she went back with her bat. On the Favara property, she spotted the car still covered in her son's blood. She started releasing all of her anger and smashed the car. John Favara came outside and started yelling at her, claiming she would have to pay for the damages. According to people close to John Favara, he was also receiving death threats. They also claimed that his car was vandalized, with someone spray painting the word murderer on it. Tensions were boiling for both parties. Both families needed to get away for a while. John Gotti made plans for his family to fly out to Florida for the summer to grieve. John Favara started discussing plans to move with his family, but his plans were halted when the wrong people came around his neighborhood. In 1980, John Gotti was a captain in the Gambino family. While he wasn't running the show yet, he still had a lot of influence in the criminal underworld. If he wanted someone out of the way, he knew exactly who to turn to in order to make that person disappear. The thing is, John Gotti didn't initially want to take revenge on his neighbor, but his wife was distraught, so he promised her that the neighbor would pay for what he did. Revenge didn't happen immediately after the funeral, but Favara started getting signs that he was in trouble. He had yet to get his car repaired after the accident. On April 13, 1980, it was stolen from his home and found less than a mile from his home a few weeks later on May 1st. Later in May, he received a card from Frank Gotti's funeral service in his mailbox, which he perceived as a warning. Now, John Gotti wasn't the only member of the Gambino family that Favara was familiar with. He was longtime friends with Anthony Zappo, whose father, Ettore, was a Gambino capo. Favara turned to Anthony for help with the situation. His friend advised him that his best move was to sell his house and relocate. The Favaras ended up taking his advice and putting their house for sale on the market. They even found an interested buyer, but things weren't moving along fast enough for the Gottis. Of course, if John Favara disappeared, the Gottis would be the #1 suspect. John Gotti knew how this went, so if he wanted to plan out his revenge, he needed to make sure that his family was nowhere near the scene of the crime when it happened. With that, they packed their bags and the Gotti family flew out to Florida on July 25, 1980. On the morning of July 28, 1980, John Favara left his house to go to work. As he was leaving, a group of men abducted him. Witnesses claim that these men were beating him over the head with clubs and then forcing him into a van. That was the last time anyone saw John Favara alive. Law enforcement immediately started investigations after it was reported that John Favara was missing. While John Gotti was a prime suspect, there wasn't anything they could do to convict him. After all, there was no body, no evidence, and the Gottis were out of town on the date of his disappearance. Of course, they were questioned when they returned on August 4th. Both John and Victoria Gotti knew exactly what to say when the time came. "I don't know what happened to him, but I'm not sorry if something did. He never sent me a card. He never apologized. He never even got his car fixed." Victoria Gotti. "I'm not sorry the guy is missing. I wouldn't be sorry if the guy turned up dead." John Gotti. While the body was never found, John Favara was officially declared dead in 1983. His wife did end up selling the home in Herald Beach and moving away with her 2 sons to live in privacy. Even though the crime was never solved, plenty of theories and speculations hit the surface. One of the most common theories revolves around a barrel of acid. Charles Carneglia was a hitman for the Gambino family. In 2009, he was on trial for racketeering and murder. While the Favara case wasn't a murder that he was being charged with, there was suspicion that he was involved. This was because he allegedly told 2 informants that he put John Favara's body in acid to dissolve it. There are also several stories going around about how Favara was taken out before going into the acid. One count claims that Favara was shot with a .22 caliber pistol. Others claim that he was dismembered with a chainsaw. There was even a story going around that he was still alive when the mobsters started to dismember him. Now, there were also stories going around about where this barrel was dumped. The most common story is that it was put in the ocean, but other stories claim that the barrel was buried in concrete. This is something that we may never get answers to. Ultimately, there were no consequences for John Gotti or the Gambino crime family for the disappearance of John Favara. This was another case where if the Mafia wanted someone gone, they could make them vanish. Mafia hitmen are experts in the field of making people disappear. The best hitmen get rid of the body and leave no clues about the crime behind. The Mafia Code of Silence also played a big role in why Gotti never got caught. The Omerta is the Mafia's life or death code of silence. No matter what happens, who's being charged, or what the outcome could be, Mafia members must keep their lips sealed about all activity between mob members. Many members and associates of the Gambino family may have known about the plot to kill John Favara and where his body was buried, but not one of them ever spoke about it. Even if someone was tempted to do the right thing and come forward with the information they knew, it wouldn't be in their best interest. The Mafia is known for intimidation tactics. If someone within the mob spoke, it wouldn't just be their own life at risk. Mob members would also threaten their families and closest allies' lives. People were too afraid to speak up about what they knew. John Favara's disappearance remains an unsolved mystery to this day. Investigators have searched some of the areas where his body was believed to be. However, his remains were never found. While the case remains unresolved, it still fascinates true crime enthusiasts today. While the public is sure they know who did it and why, there are still so many questions surrounding the case. However, one thing we do know about this case is that it left a huge mark on John Gotti's reputation in the criminal underworld. It showed people how ruthless and cunning he could be when pushed to the limit. Gotti was willing to go to any length to protect what was important to him. It was also the start of a chain of events with this notorious mafia figure. Once he gained more power in the Gambino family, he was known to order hits on just about anyone who got in his way. This wraps up our video on the disappearance of John Favara. Favara was once a middle-class family man who lived an ordinary life, but one wrong decision he made cost him his life. When he decided to get behind the wheel that afternoon, he was in no condition to drive. On his way home, he struck an innocent 12-year-old child who happened to be the son of one of the most ruthless mafia criminals in the area, John Gotti. John Gotti's wife Victoria was an absolute mess after the incident. She wanted revenge on the neighbor who took her son's life. She was spiraling out of control. While John Gotti had no intentions of seeking revenge, he believed he had to before his wife did something. John Gotti and his family went on a vacation to Florida while his crew took care of Favara. Nobody ever saw John Favara again. This unsolved crime was just the beginning of John Gotti's legacy of fear. He went on to become one of the most ruthless mafia bosses of the Gambino crime family. We hope you enjoyed today's video. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe to see more Mafia Mystique content.